Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you? Very good. I guess you can hear me then. So, thanks for everybody that stayed today for the feature presentation this afternoon. I'm Mike Scheibel. I'm going to be talking on nesting eagles. Many of you know that I've spent a lot of time in the last, say, 40 years working on ospreys, so it's a bit of a stretch for me to talk about a different raptor, but I'll do the best I can. So, how'd that get in there? Earlier today, many of you heard from Tom Rowinski of the U.S. Forest Service talk eloquently about the deer overabundance issues that we are experiencing here on eastern Long Island. And I wish Tom was still here because I do have the answer. So, by the 1960s, the story of the bald eagle in New York State seemed to be coming to a conclusion. Along the shores of Hemlock Lake in upstate New York, a single pair of bald eagles continued to nest every year. Every year they defend territory, they go through courtship displays, lay eggs, incubate, and the eggs would not hatch. Every year this continued and no production. And the reason I mentioned this Hemlock Lake nest in the beginning is it's very significant because it was the last known bald eagle nest in New York State in 1965. Today's story picks up in the decades that followed, and what ensued was a cooperative effort between New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Cornell University, and a whole host of public and private entities that pooled their resources, and what ultimately became perhaps the most remarkable and successful conservation stories of our time. So that recovery will be the focus of my talk today. Along the way, these are the major topics that I'll cover. I hope I don't get, I want to talk about eagle biology because it's interesting and I get a lot of people ask questions about bald eagles, how big are they, that kind of thing. But I hope now, I know I have an audience that knows a lot of this stuff. So please feel free to correct me. But we'll go through some of this life history information, some of their previous historical abundance and distribution in New York State, their legal status, what it was, what it is now, the decline that led to the situation we had in 1965, and the restoration success story, a little bit about, toward the end, the actual, referring to the title of Bald Eagles Nesting on Long Island. We'll talk about that as well. So I like to start kind of at the very beginning. If you go back to the 1700s, there was a guy that was attempting to put some order to the natural world. His name was Carl Linnaeus, and in 1766, he described the bald eagle as a species, and he gave it a name, or he gave it two names, a Latin name that folks all know about how that's done. So the eagle is a bird. It's in the class Aves. It's now in the order Accipitriformes. It's in the family Accipitridae. There are about 20 different species. This is the family of hawks and eagles. And generically, it's in the genus Haliaetus, which is Greek, I believe. First part, Hali, referring to salt or sea, and the second part referring to eagles. These are literally sea eagles. There are 3 species in the world in this genus. And the specific name, leucocephalus, which refers to the white head of the adult bald eagle. Now, I found a lot of explanations for why they're called bald eagles. The one I didn't find was that they don't have any hair or feathers on top of their head. So what they do have is white feathers. And the most plausible explanation seems to be that it derived from an Old English term, B-A-L-D-E, meaning white or white-headed. So as far as distribution goes, bald eagles are strictly a North American phenomenon. They're only found in North America. And they have quite a wide breeding distribution all the way from Alaska, which really has always been the stronghold for the bald eagle in North America. They're found nesting throughout much of Canada, and down into the Pacific Northwest. They're also quite a stronghold for bald eagles in Florida, as many of you must know. So if we look historically, there's not a lot of evidence here, or not a lot of information, but we do know that there were approximately 70 to 80 bald eagle nesting territories within the state of New York. I highlight again the Hemlock Lake nest. I'm not sure you can see in that previous slide just where that is, but it's one of the westernmost Finger Lakes in upstate New York. If we look a little closer to home, historically, this information I found in John Bull's book, Birds of New York State, of the New York State area. I recommend it highly to any of you that are interested in birds in particular. It's great information in that book. But he writes that during the 1870s and 1890s, that eagles were breeding locally near the Hudson River. And here's a quote in there that, referring to the bald eagle nesting, that undoubtedly they bred in the more remote areas of New Jersey and Long Island, but that we have very little information on this. It's kind of too bad we don't have more information about the former nesting on Long Island, but kind of fun to think that anyone would describe Long Island as remote. The information we do have for sure is that the bald eagles continued to nest on the very end of Long Island on the privately owned Gardiner's Island up until the year 1930. So a little bit about description of the bald eagle. This was thought of as by our forefathers as a symbol of strength and independence. It was chosen as our national bird on June 20th of 1782. There's a story that's often told about Ben Franklin and how he vigorously objected to the fact that it was chosen over the wild turkey, which he considered to be a far more noble bird. The classic whitehead and whitetail of the full adult is hard to mistake for anything else. Although you can't believe how many times people see great black-backed gull on the East End and think it's an eagle. But now that eagles are going to become a more common sight, I think there'll be less and less of that. The birds have the same, the adult male and female has essentially identical plumage, so it's very difficult to tell them apart except for size. As is the case with most raptors, the males are smaller, the females are larger. So the range in size goes somewhere from below 3 feet on up to about 3 feet in stature. Their weights can go from 8 to 14 pounds, and wingspan somewhere on the order of 6 to 7 feet. So they are the largest member of the hawk and eagle family in North America. Remember that slide with the Accipitra D family? They're the largest members. So a lot of you are probably thinking, well, what about the condor? Well, technically the condor is in a different family. It is larger than a bald eagle. But it's in the family with the New World vultures. Golden eagle is very close in size. We're going to talk a little more specifically about that in a minute. More information in terms of life history. They're a very long-lived bird. I think the record in the wild is 28 years and something like 36 years in captivity. Earlier this year, probably starting in the very early part of February, in our area, aerial courtship would begin. And this is oftentimes two adult birds soaring high. They're known for locking talons in midair and tumbling out of the sky. It's really a magnificent thing to witness. I hope many of you will get to do that over the next several years if you haven't already. They have very strong nest site fidelity. In other words, they return to the same nest sites year after year. They tend to mate for life, as do ospreys, but there's a limit to that, we found. And certainly if one member of the pair does die, the surviving member will not mourn for the rest of their lives, but find a new mate. In our area, they seem to be using live oaks and pine trees predominantly as the species of choice. Incubation of 1 to 3 eggs is the normal. It takes 35 days, which coincidentally is exactly the same incubation period as the osprey has. Fledging occurs in about 12 weeks. So think about that. In 3 months, those baby eagles that hatch out go all the way from hatching to learning to fly, to taking flight, I should say, in 12 weeks. They grow to their full adult size. So these eagles may go from a few ounces to 10 pounds in 12 weeks. Even I haven't been able to attain that rate of weight gain, though I try. Full independence from the adults and from the nest site occurs in about 20 weeks of time. So during the 4 to 5 years it takes to reach sexual maturity, bald eagles go from being very fluffy and downy in the upper right-hand picture. Let's see if I can work this thing. Yep. These are the nestlings. These are the birds before first flight. Over the next 4 to 5 years, they're going to go through a variety of plumages, but they basically all dark bird with some mottling or blotchy white, and varying, that becomes more and more noticeable around the head, and then toward year 4, you get white in the tail and white in the head. A little bit about the differences between these two raptors that are essentially the same size, the golden eagle and the bald eagle. Now, golden eagle is more of a western bird, but we do have them in New York State. They nest in New York State. There have been records I saw just earlier this morning of birds in the Finger Lakes area. Dutchess County is a good place to look for golden eagle. If you see a large eagle soaring around Long Island, it's most likely going to be a bald eagle. Could be a golden eagle. Here's what to look for. Look at, especially at the head size, much smaller, noticeably smaller in the golden eagle than the bald eagle. Tends to be a little more order to the white in the underwing surfaces, white at the base of the primaries, not always there, but it's a good thing to look for in distinguishing golden eagles, and also white at the base of the tail. Everybody got that? Good. Okay. So eagles can be found pretty much anywhere where there are big bodies, large bodies of water, and large trees. They need large trees for not only nesting purposes, but for perching. They do a lot of perching in favorite locations where they wait for the right moment to go out and seek their prey. Another requirement in terms of habitat is that they have plenty of fish and ducks and other food to eat. By the way, this photograph was taken probably about 3 miles from here this winter. So in terms of what they eat, represented in this pie chart, fish make up the great majority of what they do eat. Somewhere I've seen, maybe 60% of what they eat is fish, followed by birds, something around 25 or 30% of their diet, mammals and other prey making up the remainder of their diet. These birds are, like other raptors, are opportunistic feeders. They'll take just about anything, and particularly in the case of the bald eagle, and this is what Franklin's objection was based on, or part of what his objection was based on, is they're carrion eaters. Carrion, as you all know, is meat. It's dead animal flesh, usually in a decaying, usually decaying. So that's what they eat. No discussion about bald eagles in an area that already hosts quite a few ospreys would be complete without talking about kleptoparasitism. This simply is the larger bald eagle and the osprey vying for the same prey. The osprey goes out and catches a fish, and en route back to a favorite eating spot or his nest, the eagle intercepts. So before we all get very excited about what ospreys nesting in our area now might mean for the local, I should say, eagles now nesting in osprey territory, you got to remember that these are old, time-evolved behavioral relationships between these two species. If you look down to the Chesapeake, they have somewhere on the order of 1,000 nesting bald eagles in that region and about 5,000 nesting ospreys. So obviously they found a way to work it out. Nevertheless, I think it's going to be very interesting over the next few years to watch some of these interactions. I've already seen some of this out on the East End. This is the typical roll and grab where the eagle might come in from above, plunge below the osprey, and then rear up with its formidable talons to try to grab something from the much smaller osprey. So getting to the reasons of decline, bald eagles, as I mentioned, in the 60s were down to one nest in the 1960s. So how did they get there? Many factors contribute to population decline, but in general, loss of suitable habitat is right up there. Human development and associated disturbance is generally the cause of this kind of habitat loss. And aside from the bald eagle story specifically, loss of habitat obviously has profound effects on many different species of raptors and wildlife for that matter. I want to mention that the Nature Conservancy, the organization I work for, is recognizing the importance of preserving and protecting habitat. And today's mission of the Conservancy is to conserve those lands and waters on which all life depends. Hand in hand with the loss of habitat goes the loss of prey or prey decline. If you think about the rivers that used to teem with fish in the United States and even on Long Island, you think about alewives that are going to start running upstreams or trying to run upstreams any day now here in our area. A lot of them are not able to get all the way up as far as they need to get to breed. Well, that causes a reduction in the numbers of alewives. Numbers of waterfowl. Waterfowl, this used to be a waterfowl mecca. Numbers of black ducks and other waterfowl have been greatly reduced over what they were in the beginning of the last century. So those are long-term declines. Some shorter-term declines that occurred in the early part of the 20th century was shooting losses. And one of a fascinating statistic, I think, or alarming statistic is, and this comes from a publication written by Arthur Cleveland Bent. I think maybe many of you will know that his Life Histories of North American Birds. If you don't know about it and you're interested in birds at all, I find those documents to be fascinating, just great information on life history that you won't find anywhere else. It's not a field guide, it's information about life history of our North American birds. So anyway, he reports that during the early 1900s, they were paying bounties in Alaska, starting in, I believe it was 1910 or thereabouts. And during the first 10 years of the program, they paid bounties on 41,812 eagles. So undoubtedly, there was direct impact there. But by far the greatest impact on eagle populations was the widespread use of pesticides, namely DDT, starting in the 1940s. Eggshell thinning that led to the hatching failure in that last nest in the Hemlock Lake was being played out in nests of many large raptors, ospreys among them, throughout much of the Northeast and throughout much of the United States for that matter. Just a huge problem. So this is a little bit of a side story perhaps, but I think it's an important one and very much related. This gentleman was from Britain. He came to New York in the 1930s, and he came hoping to see an osprey. They're already gone from Britain. He settled just a few miles from this building, down the Carmens River in the hamlet of Brookhaven. And there he did indeed see ospreys, and he regularly traveled for many years, up until about a year before his death, believe it or not, to Gardiner's Island, where he would survey ospreys and record the number of young in each nest. And in the 1950s, he noticed a disturbing pattern, that there were broken eggshells in the nest. When scientists made the link between osprey nesting failure and DDT, he did what, in retrospect, we all wish we had the conviction and stamina to do. And in his words, he sued the bastards. Dennis and a few other folks went into court right here in Suffolk County, and they sued. It was called the Suffolk County Mosquito Commission at the time, and he managed to get an injunction that stopped the Mosquito Commission from spraying DDT. So I doubt there's anybody in this room that isn't familiar with that story to some degree or another. But I wanted to mention on a personal level that I was fortunate enough to grow up just down the street from the Puleston family in the 1960s. And also to have fellow Environmental Defense Fund founding father, Art Cooley, as my high school biology teacher, was likely how I ended up working in conservation for the last 40 years. And it's a reminder, I think, to all of us that conservation can and does start locally. So just a quick review of some of the legislation that got put into place to help protect bald eagles. The Lacey Act of 1900, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which not only protected migratory birds such as eagles, but primarily migratory waterfowl, which is an important prey item for the eagle. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act of all the way back to 1940, still in place today. And of course, the endangered species legislation that occurred in the late 60s and early 70s. So I want to talk now a little bit about restoration. How is it that we have eagles back in New York State? And part of it is, of course, for the reasons that I outlined about DDT had a tremendous effect on not only eagles, but other raptor populations. But to kind of jumpstart that restoration, the DEC in the mid-70s was considering a restoration project. And they wanted to use a technique that was developed first by falconers, and that's called hacking. And basically what hacking means is hand-rearing young birds to independence. But before they really started with that, I mean, they realized these laws were starting to be put in place. They know that DDT was banned in the early 70s, but there were a lot of questions about whether or not this technique would work. Among them would be, can eagles, minus their parents, learn to hunt on their own? Is there enough suitable habitat left in New York State where bald eagles can still successfully nest? And even will hacking work? It was never really tried. There was a lot of experimentation by a guy by Heinz Meng in New Paltz. This fellow who was a professor of mine, Tom Cade, at Cornell, was experimenting with doing the same sort of work with peregrines, but nobody had done it with eagles. So in 1976, they built this tower. I'm sorry for the quality of the photo, but it's old. And they went out and got eagles to put in these cages on top of these platforms where they could be fed remotely so they wouldn't imprint on human beings. And gradually the bars were taken down and the birds were let loose to fly on their own and learn to hunt. A lot of the young eagles came from a variety of states, including Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and a captive breeding program in Maryland. But probably the great majority of them came from Alaska. Alaska to this day boasts a very robust bald eagle population. I think the population today is in excess of 5,000 birds, something like that. There's a lot of bald eagles in Alaska, so that was a good place to get some of these hacking candidates. So that's what they did. They went up to Alaska and took these birds out of wild nests in Alaska and crated them up and flew them back down to New York and let them go. There were several hacking locations, but the first one was at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge up in central New York. And it was a tremendously successful program. During the 13 years that they released eagles in New York, they released almost 200. There were other programs in other states taking place at about the same time, but the total release in New York made up about half. I think there was a total of about 400 birds released in hacking programs in the Northeast, and about half of those were New York hacked birds. One of the questions about will they learn to fly and hunt and survive on their own to time of first breeding was answered very quickly. In 1980, they found one of the first birds, the first hacking candidate from 1976 was found nesting in northern New York. And by 1989, their original goal for this project of achieving 10 bald eagle nests in the state was achieved. Looking at breeding bird data from just after that period, I realize this is probably really, very difficult to see, but this is the first breeding bird atlas work that was done in 1980 to 85. They identified about a dozen potential bald eagle nesting sites during that early 80s period. And then 20 years later, when that breeding bird atlas work was done for the second time in New York, there had significantly more sites active in New York State. This graph shows the success of the program going back to, you recall, the Hemlock Lake nest, just one bird, one pair of birds, gone up now. The best estimate, the hardest figures I've seen so far go up to 2010, but the estimates now, as of 2015, is that we're right around 300 nesting pairs in the state of New York. We mentioned, in addition to now an important nesting area for bald eagles, New York has a lot of prime wintering habitat, not only for its resident eagles, but for eagles that nest primarily to the north in Canada, will actually leave those more northern latitudes, come down and try to find open water in the New York area. So there are places along the Hudson, particularly around Croton, New York, where you can go and in a day maybe see close to 100 eagles wintering along the river. I think Long Island's starting to become one of those wintering areas as well. A review of the legal status. One of the things about, I worked a lot at the DEC in endangered species, and you list a bird or a species is endangered. What do you want to do? You want to get it off the list. Too often they get them off the list because they become extirpated. In the bald eagle's case, there was a success story. They were taken off the threatened list in '95, proposed for delisting by 1999, and on June 28th of 2007, they were taken off the list altogether. Well, finally, a long way of working around to talking about Long Island specifically, but this map is that I put together about a week ago is happily out of date, but this shows the general location of the three nesting locations for bald eagles in our area. So we have Gardiner's Island, Shelter Island, the same thing Maryland did, and Carmen's River, just down the river from us. So the first nest, Gardener's Island. By the way, I'm not going to get real specific about locations for obvious reasons. It couldn't be more true on Gardener's Island, which is a very private and somewhat secretive island. But on a cold day in December in the year 2006, Mary Laura Lamont was part of a small group of birds counting birds on a Christmas bird count on the privately owned Gardener's Island. She observed a full adult bald eagle very close to a very large nest, and an immature bird also close. In fact, I think the immature bird was on the nest. She wondered to herself, was she witnessing history? Had a dream come true that other naturalists like Dennis Pulston, Paul Stoutenberg, Gil Rayner, Leroy Wilcox, and others wouldn't live long enough to actually see. So for the first time in 76 years, bald eagles were again nesting on Gardener's Island. You recall that slide where we talked about the last known nest in our area was 1930. This was exciting to say the least. I don't want to mention that the present day owners of the island are adamant, to say the least, about retaining their privacy and the privacy and protection of their nesting eagles. A safer, more secure location in the Long Island region could not be hoped for. So the second nest, this was 2006. The second nest was right down the road here, right down the river. In the spring of 2013, a visitor to the Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge came across a large nest, which turned out to be a bald eagle nest. This nest is in a live pitch pine tree, and although they haven't been successful that we're aware of to date, this is going in now to the third year. The birds are back at the nest site, I do know that, and they will be carefully monitored by refuge personnel. The third nest to come along, shot by Derek Rogers in March of 2014, was right at the preserve where I work, the Mashomick Preserve on Shelter Island. Conveniently nested in an area that we have restricted public access to, so that's a good thing. They picked a very convenient location for protection. And I happened to cross the nest in late January of 2014, thinking to myself initially, well, there's an osprey nest that I don't know about. It's a little embarrassing because I'm the osprey survey guy, and this is right in my backyard, essentially. But something didn't look quite right. And so I had the feeling, since we'd been seeing quite a few eagles around, that this might be an eagle nest. I went back on March 5th of 2014, and lo and behold, there was an adult in an incubating posture in this nest. So we were tickled to death. This year, the birds are incubating again. They start really early down here, probably by late February, early March. The birds here at Mashomick nested successfully last year, having two young birds that fledged on the 4th of July. So this is why my earlier map is out of date, because Derek sent me this picture, this photo taken by John Gluth in the Bayard cutting arboretum in the Connecticut River drainage just last week. This is a 4-year-old bird that we think may be a male, and a full adult that we think is the female, starting to usurp an osprey nest. So it's going to be interesting to see what's happening probably right now or very soon when the ospreys come home. So that constitutes the 4th nest that I'm aware of in our Long Island region to date. I'd be willing to bet there's one or two I'm missing. If anybody knows of them, let me know. But any big area, I think that whole Connecticut River State Park area is a great area. Hempstead Lake State Park, just to name two of the large areas that could potentially support more bald eagle nests. So if you're already getting tired of seeing eagles, I get lots and lots of reports. Seems like hardly a day goes by where somebody doesn't report a bald eagle now on Long Island. If you're getting sick of seeing them, this is the guy you want to complain to. Pete and I ran the Endangered Species Unit for the DEC for 35 years. And if you can blame any one single individual for why we're seeing so many eagles, this is the guy. He not only, as unit leader, presided over policy decisions, meeting with politicians and his bosses at the DEC, drew up budgets and so forth. He's the guy that strapped on the climbing gear, went up into these nests, and got the hacking candidates that led to the successful restoration of the species in New York State. Future of the eagle seems to be very bright in New York State. I want to draw your attention, though, to this document. It's in circulation now. You can go online and get this. It's a draft conservation plan for the bald eagle in New York State. They're accepting comments, I think, until early April. So it's got a lot of good background information, covers a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about in more depth. And so if you're interested, that's a good document to look up. You may even want to send comments their way. So in closing, I just want to say that the Conservancy is protecting nature and preserving life. This is the Mashomick Preserve, many of you know, on Shelter Island. A lot of the large land purchases that we've been involved with, going back in this case to 1980, I think it's safe to say we didn't buy this piece of property and protect it for bald eagles, but that certainly has been one of those unintended consequences that seem to work out pretty well. I thank you for your time, and that's it.